welcome back. In the previous video, we were working on this weather API project, and we talked about promise and fetch, and we solved a few of the challenges. Actually, we solved the first two challenges, right? And now we're on to challenge number 3. Okay, so in the previous video, what we looked at is we looked at promise, and in the earlier videos we also looked at callbacks. And we saw that, callbacks are really useful. And then we saw that promise looked a little weird. Let's talk about promise for a minute. Like, why do we even have this thing, right? So promise is there because it makes our work with callbacks a lot easier. It may not seem like that because this maybe looks a little abstract, but if we did all this stuff with callbacks, there's a few problems that we could run into, and I could try and illustrate those, but I think it's easier just to go with what we have here and just kind of trust me on this one and say, like, yeah, maybe it's going to be easier if we learn to use the promise, right? Trust me, after a while, if you use a promise, you'll really like them, okay, as you start to understand how they work, okay? And then if you run into some old code, or if you want to look up some code describing callback hell, it'll show the problems that you have when that you can run into with callbacks alone, okay? The thing about promise, though, is promises are built on callbacks. So the promise uses a callback. So when we call .then on our promise object, we actually supply a callback, right? And when we call .then, it supplies a callback. When we call .catch, we supply a callback, right? So promise is really built on callbacks, and it's really that the promise object just makes callbacks easier to work with, okay? That's kind of like the short answer, okay? So let's talk about challenge number 3 for a moment, okay? So challenge number 3 is to rearrange the get weather code so that it uses a promise, or it returns a promise. Okay, and so the idea here is that right now we're using a callback here, and when we receive the callback here, we run our callback, and this callback allows us to pass the JSON data back to this other block of code. But what I'd like to do is, rather than using a callback here, or a single callback all by itself, what I want to do is I want the get weather method to be more modern and use, industry best practice, which is using a promise. So I want get weather to use a promise or return a promise, and then we're going to handle the promise here, okay? So that's the goal here for challenge number 3, okay? So let me get you started, and then you can try it on your own, and then I'll walk through a solution, okay? So here I've got my get weather function, and what I want to do is I want to be able to refactor this. So I'm going to refactor the code here, so that if I rewrite the code here, I can write it in this way. I can write get weather, I can include the zip code, and I can include the API key. And if this returns a promise, I want to be able to say .then, and then include my callback function here to handle the data that is returned, okay? Or we could rearrange it like this, right? And this callback is essentially the same callback that you have here. So this one receives data, so you should be able to receive data here. And then this one, sets the inner HTML of those elements, and you should be able to do the same thing here, okay? So this is what we need to do. But what needs to happen here is get weather needs to return a promise. So it has to return a promise to us so we can call .then on that promise, okay? And then if you wanted, you could also call .catch to handle errors, and that would be like an upgrade to the code here. Okay, so this is the code we currently have, and it works with the way the code is right now. We want to make the code work like this, okay? So we're going to have to make a couple changes in index.html, right? So if you think you have a solution to that one, go ahead and give it a try. And then I'll go through a solution in a moment, okay? So you can stop the video and try your solution if you want, and then you come back. Okay, so how did you do there? Let's give it a try. I'm going to comment this block of code out here, right? And I'm going to go back to my index JS. And what I want to do here is I want to return a promise from this function. Okay, so essentially I want to return, return a promise, right? And there's a few ways you can, can I not spell today? There we go, promise, right? So we want to return a promise here. We're going to remove the success callback, right? We can leave units in there as an optional parameter. And if you look here, that kind of fits the signature of the function that we've written, right? It takes 2 parameters now instead of 3, okay? So we can get rid of success callback there, and we could take an optional 3rd parameter that would be the units. So now over here, I could include units if I wanted, right? But we'll just leave it like that and stick with the default unit of imperial. Okay, so let's talk about what's happening here, right? So I've got fetch, and then I set my path, and then I call .then on the promise that's returned, and then when that promise resolves, I get a response object, and on that response object, we're going to say response.json, and this actually returns a promise also. So actually what we really want to do is we just want to return the value from the promise here. Okay, so when we call response.json, we just want to return that, and then all of this other stuff can just be deleted. I know it sounds kind of simpler than you think, right? So actually, let's see here. So actually I think what we can do is even just do that. Okay. I know that maybe that doesn't sound satisfying to you, but I think that that is our whole solution, right? Let's give it a try. So I'm going to type in 90210, 62 degrees, right? So it seems to be working. And you could write this in a longer form if you want to maybe kind of understand what's going on there. Let's give it a try, right? So there's our short answer. Let's do a long form answer, right? So I'm going to copy the code here and let's rewrite it. So I'm going to say const promise. Let's do response promise. I don't know, right? Like that, okay? And on the next line, I'm going to say, how about let's do response promise dot then, okay? Right? And this is going to return another promise. So let's do const JSON promise equals response.json, right? So we're going to say response promise, let's do, maybe we should spell that out. There you go, right? So from our response promise, it's going to resolve to a response object, and then we're going to say, and remember there's a return here, it's implied, right? So this is actually, when you call .then, it's actually going to return the value that you have here, right? So response.json is going to return the JSON promise, right? And so this promise promises a JSON object, right? So what we want to do is just return that. So if I say return JSON promise, then we're done. And that's like the long form of what we have here. Okay, so let's save that and give it a try. What if I do 010? Oh yeah, 28 degrees, overcast clouds. Weather data is fun, right? So right, I don't know, I love just inventing zip codes and see if they show up, right? But anyway, there we go, right? So we called fetch, it returned an object. I got the object here, it's a promise object. It has a method on it called then. So we're going to call .then. And then that promise is going to resolve to a response object, right? And when it resolves to a response, we can call .json on that response to say, yeah, like, hey, the response is a connection to the server, so we can say like how we want to stream the data from the server. So here I'm saying like, hey, let's stream that data as JSON. And saying we want to stream the data is not the same thing as saying the data was streamed. So that's why it returns a promise. So we're saying like, hey, why don't you promise to stream some data as JSON for me, right? And so this promise is an object, and internally it's doing the work of streaming the data, right? And if that data is streamed successfully and it resolves, then this promise will resolve to a success and you can handle it, and it'll return some JSON to you, right? And so the resolution of this promise we're going to handle over here with .then, right? So get weather is going to return the JSON promise, and then we're going to call .then on it, and the JSON data will be here. And if this failed, we could say .catch on the end of this promise and include, you know, an error handler, right? So that's basically just another function. Let's actually, we can remove those because we only have one parameter, right? So we can say console log. We'll just log our error message, right? It's hard to simulate an error with this because the error has to happen actually at the server, right, for this error to show up, right? I don't know if it would show an error. I think we'd get a different kind of error if I just turned off the Wi-Fi. But anyway, this error, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to check this error, right? So we'll talk more about error checking later. But take my word for it. If there was an error, we would pick it up here. Okay. But anyway, so hopefully that was interesting to you, and maybe this solution here maybe surprised you, maybe it didn't, maybe you already had it figured out. And if you didn't, and we solved it here, you know, go through this and make sure you understand what happened at each step there. And you can, like in the earlier video, I said read the section on JS info about promises, and then come back to read that, and then come back here and you know, reconcile the two. Okay. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll continue in the next video.